put the broke sister in the back. Prudence laughed, raising her champagne glass so the entire head table could hear. Dad smirked, barely glancing up from his phone where he was checking the morning business news. Then, his face went completely blank. Mystery billionaire reveals ownership of Azure Estate, he read aloud, his voice devoid of all its usual arrogance. The photograph on the screen was mine. The estate manager stepped up to the microphone, pointing directly at the back table. The owner is here. I leaned back, calm enough to hear the ice crack in my sister's glass. Surprise, I said. Thank you for watching. Before I take you back there, do me one small favor. Take a second to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. It helps more than you know. My name is Opal. I am 42 years old, and my family thinks my biggest achievement is figuring out the local public transit schedule. In the grand theatrical production that was my family, I was always cast as the failure, the shadowy disappointment standing quietly behind the glowing brilliance of the golden child. Prudence was the royalty of our household. She was 35, a luxury event planner, who carried herself as if she had personally invented elegance, treating every room she entered like her own little kingdom. My father, Heron, owned a logistics and supply company, and he measured a person's worth entirely by the balance of their bank account and the brand of their car. My mother, Nayan, measured worth by appearances, constantly seeking validation from the upper crust of society, while carefully hiding anything she deemed unseemly. And to them, I was entirely unseemly. They thought I lived in a tiny rented apartment on the rundown side of town, struggling to make ends meet in a mediocre administrative job. They did not know the apartment was actually a sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse that I owned outright. They mocked the simple white button-down shirts I wore to family dinners, completely unaware that they were custom-tailored pieces worth more than their entire weekly grocery budgets. They measured success by the size of the flashy logo on a designer handbag, or the volume of their own bragging. I measured success by the property deeds locked securely inside my hidden wall safe, but they did not know that. For 15 years, I had built a massive enterprise in total silence, carefully stacking stone upon stone, while they built their lives out of fragile glass. They had absolutely no idea that I was the chief executive officer and sole founder of Azure Holdings, a luxury real estate and resort development firm valued at over $5 billion. I let them believe I was weak. I let them believe I was poor. I became the perfect prey, waiting patiently for the predators to step blindly into my snare. The only person in our bloodline who ever saw my true potential was my grandmother, Rowena. When I was just a young girl, watching my parents shower Prudence with expensive gifts while handing me her discarded leftovers, Grandma Rowena would pull me aside and wipe my tears. She was a woman of immense grace and profound wisdom. She understood that the deepest power does not roar, it whispers. Build an empire so quiet, Opal, she used to tell me, holding my hands in hers. Build an empire so quiet that they only hear about it when it is entirely too late to stop you. When she passed away, she left behind a stunning antique sapphire brooch. It was a family heirloom of staggering sentimental value, a piece she explicitly told my mother was meant for me on the day I finally found my own path. My mother had promised to keep it safe. That promise, like every other word spoken in our house, was a beautiful hollow lie. True power is born in the dark, cultivated in the absolute silence of rejection. You do not build a fortress because you love the stone. You build it because you have survived the arrows. The final arrows were fired on a humid Friday evening during the rehearsal dinner for Prudence's extravagantly overpriced wedding. Prudence was marrying Preston, a 38-year-old man with a hollow laugh and a spine made of absolute jelly, a man who survived by nodding aggressively at whatever my sister or father said. The dinner was held at a stuffy, pretentious country club, funded by money my father no longer actually had. I sat quietly at the end of the long mahogany table, wearing one of my plain white shirts, listening as the grand illusion of my family's wealth began to desperately fray at the edges. Heron had drank 3 glasses of scotch and was complaining loudly about his logistics company. The business was bleeding cash, suffocating under a mountain of crushing debt, and he was desperately looking for a corporate buyer to bail him out before the creditors seized his assets. He spoke about his employees not as human beings, but as disposable numbers holding him back from his rightful luxurious retirement. Prudence rolled her eyes, entirely uninterested in anything that did not directly involve her wedding dress or her honeymoon. Then, Prudence turned her predatory gaze toward me. She slid a large unmarked shopping bag across the table. "I bought you a dress for tomorrow, Opal," she sneered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Ach, since we all know you cannot afford anything decent, and I absolutely refuse to let you ruin my wedding photos, looking like a homeless substitute teacher." Preston laughed his terrible empty laugh. My mother smiled softly, nodding in complete agreement. I opened the bag. Inside was a dull, shapeless olive green dress that looked like it had been pulled from a discount bargain bin a decade ago. It was an insult woven into fabric, but the dress was not the ultimate betrayal. The absolute shattering of my family's facade happened moments later. Nayan stood up, tapping her spoon against her crystal glass to demand the room's attention. She reached into her expensive designer purse and pulled out a small faded velvet box. My heart completely stopped. I knew exactly what that box held. She opened it, revealing Grandma Rowena's antique sapphire brooch gleaming under the harsh chandelier light. "Prudence, my beautiful golden girl," Nayan said, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion. "Your grandmother wanted the woman who truly represents the prestige and success of this family to wear this on her wedding day. You have made us all so incredibly proud. You are the absolute best of us." And Nayan walked over and pinned the sapphire to Prudence's silk blouse. Prudence smiled, touching the jewel with greedy manicured fingers, while casting a triumphant icy glare directly at me. The mask had completely slipped. They were not just playing favorites anymore. They were actively rewriting history to erase me from the family legacy entirely. I sat perfectly still, my face drained of all emotion. I did not yell. I did not cry. The hurt simply vanished, replaced by an immense freezing clarity. The bait had been taken. The trap was set. I stood up, leaving the ugly green dress on the chair, and walked out into the cool night air without saying a single word. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat in the profound silence of the empty parking lot. My hands were completely steady. I picked up my phone and dialed the private number for Mercer, the executive manager of Azure Estate, and my most trusted corporate confidant. He answered on the first ring. "Mercer," I said, my voice as cold and hard as concrete. "It is time." "Are you absolutely sure, Opal?" he asked quietly. "Executed the buyout of Heron's logistics company immediately. Sign the final acquisition papers. Give him 0 concessions. And Mercer, prepare the main ballroom at the estate for tomorrow. I want my official introduction to the staff and the guests handled precisely at the start of the reception." "Consider it done, Madam Chief Executive Officer," he replied. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and entirely clear. The venue Prudence had chosen was Azure Estate, the most exclusive, breathtakingly expensive, luxury wedding venue on the entire eastern seaboard. It featured sweeping emerald lawns, ancient weeping willows, and a grand ballroom, constructed entirely of imported marble and glass. My family had practically taken out a second mortgage to afford the deposit. Bragging to every single guest about the sheer prestige of the location, I arrived an hour before the ceremony. I was wearing the hideous olive green dress Prudence had given me. I wanted them to see me exactly as they always had, poor, pathetic, and entirely beneath them. As I walked through the grand entrance, the valets, the concierges, and the waitstaff all paused. They recognized me immediately. I saw the sheer panic flash in the eyes of the head coordinator, but I gave a tiny, imperceptible shake of my head. They fell back into line, offering me deep, respectful bows that my family entirely missed. My parents and Prudence were too busy holding court, posing for photographs, and acting like they owned the very air they were breathing. I watched them from the shadows. I was the predator, patiently circling my prey in the tall grass. When the ceremony ended and the guests moved into the grand ballroom for the reception, the true humiliation began. I approached the head table to hand Prudence my wedding card. Inside the envelope was a legally binding document, completely forgiving a massive loan my father's company had taken out years ago. It was a gift of immense value disguised in a cheap paper sleeve. Prudence snatched the envelope from my hand, weighing it mockingly. "Paper? Really, Opal? You could not even afford a decent blender." She let out a sharp, cruel laugh. Honestly, having you up here near the important guests is entirely depressing. She snapped her fingers at a passing waiter, put the broke sister in the back. Table 40, near the kitchen doors. I do not want her ruining the aesthetic of my reception. Heron crossed his arms, nodding in absolute agreement. Do as your sister says, Opal. You belong out of sight today. We have incredibly important business connections in this room, and you are a complete embarrassment to this family's image. I looked at my father. I looked at the sapphire brooch pinned to Prudence's extravagant gown. I felt absolutely nothing but icy resolve. Of course, I said softly. I turned and walked the long, humiliating path across the massive ballroom, past the judging whispers of the wealthy guests until I reached table 40. It was a tiny, knobbly table right next to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. It smelled faintly of dish soap and roasted garlic. I sat down alone. I folded my hands on my lap. I waited. 2 hours later, the catalyst finally arrived. The champagne was flowing. The music was loud, and Prudence had just taken the microphone to deliver a self-indulgent speech about how she and Preston were the ultimate power couple of the decade. She was mid-sentence bragging about their upcoming honeymoon in the Maldives when a strange synchronized sound echoed across the room. It was the sound of 100 cell phones buzzing simultaneously. Every business executive, every wealthy socialite, every investor in the room had just received a priority breaking news alert from the federal financial wires. Heron pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket, slightly annoyed at the interruption. He squinted at the screen. Slowly, the color completely drained from his face. His hands began to shake violently. The champagne flute slipped from Preston's grip, shattering into 100 pieces on the marble floor. What is it, Daddy? Prudence demanded into the microphone, annoyed that the spotlight had shifted. Heron's voice was barely a whisper, but in the sudden profound silence of the room, it carried perfectly. Total corporate buyout, he choked out, reading the federal acquisition filing. My company, it has been entirely acquired through hostile asset liquidation. The creditors sold the debt. A massive conglomerate just executed the deed of ownership. I am bankrupt. Nayan gasped, clutching her chest. Who? Who bought it? Heron stared at the glowing screen, his eyes wide with utter terror. He swiped to the next page of the press release. Mystery billionaire reveals ownership of Azure Estate and Azure Holdings, he read aloud, his voice cracking. He looked up, his gaze searching the room wildly until his eyes locked onto mine, sitting at the wobbly table by the kitchen. The photograph attached to the federal business filing was a professional portrait of me. Before the family could even process the sheer magnitude of the revelation, the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the ballroom swung open. Mercer, dressed in an immaculate tuxedo, strode purposefully onto the main stage. He took the microphone directly from Prudence's trembling hand. Ladies and gentlemen. Mercer's voice boomed over the state-of-the-art sound system. On behalf of the staff, I would like to apologize for the interruption. However, it is protocol to formally acknowledge the presence of our Chief Executive Officer. Please direct your attention to the back of the room. Absolute owner of the Azure Estate and the entire Azure Holdings empire is here. Mercer pointed directly at table 40. The lighting technician in the booth flipped a switch. A massive blinding white spotlight snapped on, cutting through the dim ballroom and illuminating me in my cheap olive green dress. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right before a massive avalanche completely destroys a mountainside. I stood up slowly. I picked up my glass of cheap tap water. I looked at the shattered expressions of the family who had spent 15 years treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes. I took a slow sip, enjoying the coldness of the ice against my teeth. Surprise, I said. Heron completely lost his mind. He practically shoved guests out of the way as he stormed across the ballroom, his face red with rage and humiliation. Nayan trailed behind him, weeping hysterically, while Prudence stood frozen on the stage, the facade of her perfect wedding crumbling into absolute dust. You, Heron screamed, stopping just short of my table. You bought my company. You orchestrated this entire corporate liquidation. You hid behind non-disclosure agreements and federal attorneys to steal my life's work. I did not steal anything, Heron, I replied, my voice completely flat. Your company was drowning in toxic debt. I bought your federal tax liens, paid off your creditors, and executed a completely legal corporate buyout. I saved the jobs of 300 warehouse workers you were about to fire. I am your father, he roared. You owe me control of that board. You will transfer the deed of ownership back to my name immediately. You lost the right to call yourself my father the moment you measured my worth by the clothes on my back, I said softly. Prudence finally found her voice. She ran over, her heavy wedding gown dragging awkwardly behind her. You own this venue, she shrieked, her voice shrill with sheer panic. Then you are paying for this wedding, all of it. The catering, the flowers, the entire bill. I looked at my sister. She was nothing but a fragile, terrifyingly insecure child, hiding behind a wall of expensive fabric. No, Prudence, I said, entirely calm. You signed a binding contract with Azure Estate. The invoice for tonight is $250,000. You will receive the final bill tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you default on your payment, my corporate attorneys will file a federal lien against your precious new house. I suggest you start returning those wedding gifts. Nayan reached out, trying to grab my hand. Her eyes filled with desperate, calculating tears. Opal, please. We are family. We can fix this. I pulled my hand away as if she had tried to hand me a venomous snake. I stepped closer to Prudence. With swift, precise movements, I unclasped Grandma Rowena's antique sapphire brooch from my sister's silk bodice. Prudence gasped, but she was too terrified to stop me. I held the heavy, beautiful stone in my palm. Grandma, Rowena left this for the woman who would carry on the true legacy of this family, I said, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes. A legacy of strength, quiet dignity, and actual power. It does not belong to you, and it certainly never belonged to her. I turned my back on them and walked out of my own ballroom, leaving them entirely ensnared in the spectacular ruin of their own creation. 6 weeks later, the dust had completely settled, and the landscape of our lives had permanently shifted. I sat on the private terrace of my penthouse, drinking a cup of hot black coffee, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of brilliant gold. I felt an immense, profound sense of peace. The sapphire brooch was pinned securely to my lapel. Across town, Heron was clocking in for his shift. He was no longer the arrogant owner holding court at the country club. He was a mid-level advisory employee in the very company he used to run, forced to report to a manager half his age, and strictly forbidden from accessing any executive financial accounts. Prudence and Preston had been entirely humiliated in their social circles. To pay off the staggering debt from their wedding venue contract, Prudence was forced to liquidate her precious designer handbags and sell the luxury car she loved so much. They were renting a tiny, cramped apartment on the exact side of town they used to relentlessly mock. I did not have to scream. I did not have to throw a tantrum. I simply let them show the world exactly who they were, and then I handed them the bill. True justice is not about destroying the people who hurt you with anger. Sometimes it is simply about watching them realize they can no longer reach you, and that the empire they tried to lock you out of was actually the one you owned all along. Have you ever been completely underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you the most? How did you build your own quiet empire? Tell me your story down in the comments below, and please do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of family drama and absolute justice. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next video.